The rain came down like it had a personal grudge against Lila Harper. It hammered the pavement outside Harborview Medical Center in thick, relentless sheets, turning the parking lot into a shallow river that swallowed the curbs and made the yellow lines disappear. Lila stood just inside the sliding glass doors of the ER exit, her navy scrubs soaked through at the shoulders from the 30 seconds she'd spent stepping outside to check if her ride had arrived. Her feet ached with the specific, bone-deep throb that only 12 hours of continuous standing could produce. Her lower back had stopped sending pain signals 2 hours ago and had moved into a kind of numb protest she'd learned to interpret as a warning. She was 26 years old and she felt 52. The ER had been a war zone tonight. A 5-car pileup on the I-90 bridge had sent 9 patients through their doors between 6 and 8 p.m. Then came the domestic calls, the overdoses, the elderly man who'd fallen down a flight of stairs and kept asking for his wife, who had been dead for 3 years. Lila had held his hand while a resident set his wrist, and she told him his wife was just in the waiting room, that she'd be right in, because sometimes the kindest thing you could do for a person was give them a few minutes of peace inside a gentle lie. She was still thinking about him when her phone buzzed. "Your driver is 2 minutes away. Black Mercedes. License plate WA7743. Lila exhaled slowly and pushed through the doors, ducking her head against the rain, her sneakers splashing through puddles as she moved toward the pickup zone at the curb. The hospital's overhead lights cast orange pools on the wet asphalt. 2 other cars idled nearby, a white sedan, a red SUV, and then, gliding silently to the curb with the kind of unhurried authority that expensive cars move with, came a black Mercedes S-Class. She didn't think twice. She yanked open the rear door, threw herself inside, slammed it behind her, and let out a breath that was equal parts exhaustion and relief. The interior was immaculate. The leather smelled faintly of cedarwood. The temperature was controlled to the precise degree that felt like being wrapped in something. Soft instrumental music played at a volume just above silence. Something with strings, something Korean, she thought dimly. The windows were tinted so dark, the city outside looked like a watercolor painting being slowly washed away. "Oh, thank God," she murmured, pulling her wet braids over one shoulder and leaning her head back against the headrest. "I have been on my feet for 12 hours. No response. She was already half closing her eyes, that particular kind of exhaustion pulling her towards sleep the way deep water pulls at a swimmer who's been fighting the current too long. She registered, somewhere in the fading edges of her awareness, that the car had not moved, that the driver had not confirmed her address, that there was something in the quality of the silence around her that was not the silence of a rideshare driver who simply hadn't heard her. It was the silence of someone waiting to see what she would do next. But that thought came and went like a dream, and Lila Harper, who had not slept more than 5 hours in the last 36, tipped sideways against the warm leather and dropped off a cliff into unconsciousness before she could catch herself. In the front seat, Victor Hwang did not move. He was 44 years old, Korean-born, and had spent the last 2 decades building an empire that governments on 3 continents preferred not to officially acknowledge. He was not a man who was surprised by things. He had long since stopped being surprised by things. He had people whose entire job was to ensure that nothing unexpected ever entered his orbit, and tonight, one of those people, specifically Kian, his enforcer and driver, who was currently running 2 minutes late because of the flooding near the garage, had let a sleeping nurse into his car. Victor looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was young. Her face, even in sleep, carried the ghost of exhaustion, a slight tension around the jaw, a faint crease between the brows that hadn't fully relaxed yet. Her scrubs were damp. There was a faint rust-colored stain near the hem of her left sleeve that he recognized with a clinical detachment as dried blood that was not hers. Her hands were folded in her lap, and they were the hands of someone who worked. Nails cut short, knuckles slightly dry, a small bruise at the inside of her right wrist where a patient had probably grabbed her. He could have woken her. He didn't. The rear door opened on the other side, and Kian slid in, his expression shifting from neutral to carefully controlled alarm the moment he registered the sleeping woman between the empty seat and the door. "Boss, Kian said, his voice just above a whisper. His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his jacket. Don't, Victor said. Kian stilled. She's a nurse. She got in the wrong car. Victor's eyes didn't leave the rearview mirror. She's asleep. Kian studied Lila with the kind of professional assessment that had nothing to do with threat level and everything to do with habit. What do you want to do? Drive verkewoin, Victor said. Kian opened his mouth. Carefully, Victor added, and something in his tone closed the conversation. The Mercedes pulled away from the curb. The rain kept falling. Lila slept for 47 minutes. She came back to consciousness the way you do when something in your body, not a sound, not a touch, but something more animal than that, decides the situation has changed and you need to be awake for it. She blinked. Then she registered the unfamiliar ceiling, the wrong darkness, the music that was not her apartment, the fact that the car had stopped and she had no memory of arriving anywhere. She sat up slowly. Kian was watching her from the front seat. Victor had turned, only slightly, so that he was visible in profile. A sharp jaw, dark eyes, silver threading through black hair at his temples, the kind of stillness that was not calm exactly, but was something else, something that had been trained into stillness the way a blade is trained to an edge. Lila blinked at them both. Then she looked out the window. They were parked in what appeared to be an underground garage. Clean, modern, lit with a low amber glow, expensive cars in the other spaces, no signs, no attendants, nothing that told her anything useful about where she was. She looked back at the two men in the front seat. This, she said, with the specific, slow delivery of someone whose brain is catching up to their situation, is not my apartment. No, Victor agreed. It isn't. You're not my driver. No. She pressed her lips together. Her heart rate, she noted with the detached professional awareness of a nurse, had gone from resting to elevated in approximately 4 seconds. She kept her voice very controlled. Where am I? You're safe, Victor said. That's the most important answer to the question you're actually asking. She stared at him. I asked where I am. And I told you you're safe. His English was precise, lightly accented. He said each word as though he meant exactly it and nothing else. You entered my car by mistake. I allowed you to sleep because you were clearly exhausted, and the storm made driving conditions poor. Now you're awake, and you can tell me your address, and Kian will take you home. Lila looked at Kian. Kian looked at the middle distance with the expression of someone who had decided that the safest thing he could do right now was exist as neutrally as possible. She looked back at Victor. You let a stranger sleep in your car? I did. Why? Something moved across his expression. Not warmth exactly. Something more like recognition. Because you were not a threat. And because you were exhausted. And because... He paused. Because it seemed like the decent thing to do. Decent, she repeated. Yes. She held his gaze for a long moment. She was running calculations that she couldn't have articulated. Reading him the way 12 years of dealing with the full spectrum of human beings in crisis had taught her to read people. There was danger in him. That was not something she could ignore or reason away. It sat in the set of his shoulders, in the quality of his attention, in the way Kian had moved his hand toward his jacket before stopping himself. This was not a man who existed in the ordinary world, but she was also still alive, and he had, apparently, let her sleep. Lila Harper, she said. My name. Victor, he said, and she understood immediately and without him saying so that it was all she was getting. She pulled out her phone. I need to call a different... Your address, he said. Kian will take you. I don't know you. No. But you're already in my car. You've been here for nearly an hour and nothing has happened to you. I'd suggest that constitutes a reasonable basis for trust. It was logical. It was also infuriating in the specific way that something logical could be infuriating when you wanted to be righteous about it. She pressed her lips together again. Fine. I live on Clement Street, the Ridgeway building. Victor nodded once to Kian. Kian started the car. Nobody spoke for the first 5 minutes of the drive. The rain had softened slightly, still falling, but no longer aggressive. The city moved past the windows in blurred streaks of light. Lila sat with her hands folded in her lap. She noticed she was mirroring the position she'd apparently fallen asleep in. and tried to organize her thoughts into something coherent. She was sitting in a luxury car belonging to a man who had not told her his last name, in the company of a man who had reached for a weapon when he saw her, and she was being driven home. She should be more afraid than she was. She examined that observation and decided it said something about her night rather than about her judgment. "The blood on your sleeve," Victor said without turning around. "Is it yours?" She looked down. "No. Patient." "You work in emergency medicine." "ER nurse. Harborview." She paused. "You could tell from the scrubs? And the fatigue, and the way you fell asleep, and the way you held your back when you got in?" He glanced at her briefly in the rearview mirror. 12-hour shift? 12.5. She watched the mirror. "You're observant. It's a professional necessity." "What profession?" The faintest pause. "Business." She almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale instead. "Okay, business." She looked out the window. The Clement Street signs were coming up. "For what it's worth, thank you for not, for letting me sleep. You needed it." "I did." She paused. "Most people would have woken me up immediately." "Most people," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that closed a door she hadn't realized was open. The car stopped in front of the Ridgeway building. Kian got out first, not to open her door, she realized, but to scan the street. The instinct of a man who moved through the world by first checking its perimeter. She got out on her own side. The rain had thinned to a mist that settled on her braids like a veil. She looked back at Victor through the open door. He was watching her. "Get some sleep," he said. "Already tried that," she said. "In your car." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something that acknowledged where a smile might be without fully committing to it. She filed it away, got her key out, and walked to her building without looking back. 2 weeks passed. She thought about him 3 times in those 2 weeks, and each time she filed the thought under strange things that happened to people in cities and moved on. She had a life. She had double shifts and meal prep she never got around to, and a group chat with her sister and 2 friends that moved too fast to keep up with. She had a supervisor who was on her case about documentation, and a patient she'd lost on a Tuesday who she kept turning over in her mind at 2 a.m. when she should have been sleeping. She did not expect to see the black Mercedes again. It was parked outside the hospital on a Thursday, 11:40 p.m., when she came out after a day shift that had gone 3 hours long because the night nurse had called in sick, and there was no coverage, and she had stayed because she always stayed. The rain was back, lighter this time, more of an atmospheric suggestion than a weather event. Kian was leaning against the car. Lila stopped walking. Kian straightened. "Miss Harper, I was asked to give you this." He held out an envelope. Thick, cream-colored, her name printed on the front in clean block letters. She took it. She looked at it. "How do you know where I work?" "You told him the name of the hospital," Kian said. She had. She'd said Harborview in the car, without thinking about it. She pressed her lips together. "What is this?" "A proposal. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to read it. Mr. Hwang only asks that you give it consideration." She stood in the mist with the envelope in her hand. Around her, the last few staff members from her shift were filtering out, climbing into cars, pulling up hoods. None of them noticed her standing very still outside a Mercedes with a man who had the bearing of someone who had made a career of being underestimated. "And if I just walk away?" "Then I drive away," Kian said, "and you never hear from us again." She opened the envelope. The letter inside was short, precise. It outlined, in language that was careful without being evasive, a part-time medical position. Discreet care for associates who required medical attention outside the hospital system. Minor injuries, routine monitoring, the kind of care that didn't require a hospital visit, but required someone who knew what they were doing. Compensation was listed, a number that made her briefly stop breathing. The terms were explicit about what would not be required. No gunshot wound concealment, no covering for serious trauma, no activity that placed her license at formal risk. At the bottom, a phone number. And you have 3 days to decide. No pressure, no obligation. She put the letter back in the envelope. She thought about her student loans. She thought about the $300 copay she'd paid last month for a prescription that the hospital's insurance should have covered and didn't. She thought about her sister in Atlanta who needed a surgery that kept getting deferred. She thought about the Tuesday patient she'd lost and the Monday patient she'd saved, and the difference between them that came down to 15 minutes and the right person being in the room. She looked at Kian. "Tell him I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for 2 days. She argued with herself the way you argue with yourself when you already know what you're going to do and you're just building the scaffolding of justification that makes it feel less reckless. She called her sister, didn't tell her why, just asked how she was doing, and her sister said tired, "Lila," just real tired in the specific voice of someone who'd stopped expecting things to get better. On day 3, she sent one text to the number at the bottom of the letter. "I have conditions." Victor called her back within 40 minutes. His voice on the phone was the same as in person, precise, unhurried, carrying the specific authority of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything. "Tell me your conditions," he said. She'd written them down. She read them. No concealment of crimes. No involvement in anything illegal. Any case presenting beyond her scope gets referred to proper medical care. She would make that call, not him. She would maintain her ER position. This was supplementary only. She would have 24 hours notice before any appointment and the right to refuse any case that compromised her ethics. Silence. Then, agreed. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected pushback on at least 3 of them. "That's it," she said. "I'm not interested in compromising your ethics," he said. "They're precisely why I'm asking you. Someone willing to look the other way would have been easier to find." She sat with that for a moment. "Okay," she said. "When do I start?" She met him the following Saturday at a building in the Belltown neighborhood she would not have looked at twice. A mid-rise with a dry cleaning business on the ground floor, a property management firm on the second. The clinic was on the 3rd floor, accessed through a back stairway that required a key card. Inside it was clean, bright, equipped better than she'd expected. Exam table, instrument tray, a medication cabinet stocked with what she actually needed, a small waiting area with 2 chairs. Victor was there when she arrived. He walked her through the space himself, which she hadn't expected. He pointed out the supply locations, the emergency protocols, the line to key in for anything she needed. He was businesslike. He did not stand too close. He did not make her feel surveilled. He made her feel like a professional who had been hired for professional reasons, which was so different from what she'd braced for that she didn't know what to do with it. "Questions?" he said when he'd finished. "Many," she said, "but I'll start with the ones that matter. Who are your associates in terms of what I'm likely to see?" He considered this. "People who exist outside the conventional structure," he said carefully. "Injuries from occupational hazards, some stress-related conditions. Occasionally, someone needs monitoring after a procedure they couldn't do through regular channels." "Couldn't or wouldn't?" "Both." She nodded slowly. "Okay, I can work with that. But I need full history on any patient you send me. Allergies, current medications, any underlying conditions." "That can be arranged." "And I set my own hours." "Agreed." She looked around the clinic again. It was quiet, this high up. The street sounds muted by the building. She could hear herself think. "Why me?" she said. "And don't say because I ended up in your car. That doesn't explain any of this." He was quiet for a moment. He was standing near the window, the gray Seattle light falling across his face, and she noticed, really noticed, for the first time outside of a dim car in a parking garage, how carefully assembled he was. The suit that fit without looking effortful, the way he held himself, which was not arrogance, but something more like the posture of a man who had learned very early that how you stood in a room determined what happened in it. "In my work," he said, "most people perform competence, they perform loyalty, they perform calm." He looked at her. "You fell asleep in a stranger's car during a rainstorm and woke up in an underground garage, and your first instinct was to assess the situation rather than panic. That's not performance. That's character." She looked at him for a long moment. "You were testing me." "I was observing you." "Those are the same thing." He almost smiled again. The same non-smile she remembered from the night in the car. Perhaps. The first month was careful. She came in twice a week, treated minor lacerations, monitored a man recovering from a fractured rib who refused to go to the hospital, helped another man manage a blood pressure situation that was edging into dangerous territory, and required honest conversation about his lifestyle, which she provided in the same no-nonsense tone she'd have used with any patient. The men who came in were uniformly nervous around her at first. Not aggressive, just uncertain, unaccustomed to being in a clinical space, unaccustomed to being cared for in a way that didn't require them to perform toughness. She handled that the same way she handled it in the ER. She talked to them like adults. She was direct. She didn't flinch. Word apparently got around. By the 5th week, patients were arriving with baked goods. Victor came by on Thursdays, ostensibly to check on the clinic, but the visits always ran 30 minutes past any practical necessity. They talked. That was the simplest way she could describe it. They talked about things that were specific to the work, and then gradually about things that weren't. He asked her once how she decided to become a nurse, and she told him the truth, that she'd watched her grandmother refuse to go to a doctor for 3 years because she couldn't afford to miss work, and that by the time she'd finally gone, the thing they found could have been treated 2 years earlier but couldn't be now. That she'd become a nurse not because it was practical or because someone encouraged her to, but because she'd needed somewhere to put the particular kind of anger that came from watching someone you loved die from something preventable. He listened without interrupting. Without offering a platitude at the end, he just said, "That's a very specific kind of grief, the kind that comes from seeing the gap between what should have been possible and what actually happened." She looked at him. "Yes, exactly that." "I know that gap," he said quietly. And she'd understood, without him explaining it, that she wasn't meant to ask, but the curiosity grew. She couldn't help it. It was the same instinct that made her a good nurse. The need to understand the full picture, the conviction that the presenting symptom was rarely the real problem. Victor Hwang was presenting as controlled and contained and purposeful, but she was increasingly aware that he was also a man carrying something heavy, and had been carrying it so long he no longer noticed the weight. She noticed it. She noticed the way he deflected personal questions with redirections so smooth it could almost pass for conversation. She noticed the way he watched the door in any room they were in together, not nervously, but automatically, the way people do when they've spent enough years having to know where the exits were. She noticed that he never ate anything in her presence, not even coffee, until he had watched her take a sip of hers first. She noticed when he started letting her talk without timing his own responses. She noticed when Thursday visits started running an hour. She noticed when she started changing her schedule on Thursdays so she wouldn't have a reason to leave early. 6 weeks in, he appeared on a Tuesday unscheduled. Kian called her at 4 a.m. His voice was compressed into the specific flatness of a man in crisis who is refusing to let it crack. "We need you at the clinic, now. It's Mr. Hwang." She was there in 22 minutes. What she found stopped her in the doorway for exactly 1 second before training took over everything else. Victor was on the exam table, upright. He'd refused to lie down. She understood instantly because he was still conscious, and refusing to be conscious made him feel like he was losing. His jacket gone, his shirt cut away by Kian's knife. He had been shot once through the left side, the entry wound clean, exit wound messier. He had a second wound at his right shoulder that was deep, but had not gone through. He was pale in the way people go pale when their body is prioritizing the core and the extremities can wait. His jaw was set with the force of a man who had decided that pain was someone else's problem. His eyes found hers the moment she crossed the threshold. "You're late," he said. "You were shot," she said, already moving, already pulling gloves, already assessing. "So, I'd say we're both having a rough morning." Kian appeared at her elbow. "Ambush. Rival faction, we think. Sung's people. We got him out. We couldn't go to a hospital." "I know," she said. "Get me the chest kit. Cabinet on the left, 3rd shelf, and call Dr. Park." She registered Kian's momentary hesitation. "Kian, Dr. Park, now. I have her number. It's in the red folder in the 2nd drawer." Dr. Elena Park had been a trauma surgeon for 25 years before her retirement. Lila had spent 3 months locating her after she'd taken this job on the logic that she would eventually need exactly this, a retired surgeon who operated in the space between official and unofficial, who had seen enough of the world to not be surprised by where expertise was sometimes required. Dr. Park had told her, when they first spoke, that she was too old to be naive and too skilled to sit on the sideline when someone was bleeding out. She'd given Lila her cell number. She arrived in 35 minutes. She assessed the situation with the compressed efficiency of someone who had not left their skill set behind, along with their hospital badge. She looked at Lila. Lila looked at her. Something passed between them that was the nonverbal equivalent of, okay, here's what we need to do. They worked in a focused, quiet partnership for 90 minutes. Lila assisted without ego, handing instruments before they were asked for, monitoring vitals with a running calm commentary, keeping the environment steady. Victor stayed conscious through most of it. She could feel his eyes on her at intervals, that same quality of attention she'd noticed from the beginning, observant and assessing and, she thought, something else now, something less guarded. At one point, when Dr. Park had stepped out to clean up, Lila was monitoring his blood pressure, and the clinic was very quiet, and his eyes were half closed, with the first real concession to pain that he'd allowed himself all night. "You're going to be fine," she said. Not reflexively, the way some people said it, but as a clinical assessment delivered with precision. "I know," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. She checked the IV line. "Does this happen often? The ambush or the being shot?" "Either." He was quiet for a moment. "Less often than it used to. More often than I'd prefer." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and there was something in the space between them that felt like the moment before a question is asked. Tense with what hasn't been said yet. "Lila," he said very quietly. "Don't try to have a meaningful conversation right now," she said. "You've lost a significant amount of blood." "I've had worse conversations in better condition." "Congratulations." She adjusted the monitoring cuff. "Sleep?" He didn't argue, which told her more than almost anything else had. Dr. Park found her in the small supply room afterward, hands braced on the edge of the sink, staring at nothing. "You care about him," Dr. Park said. Lila didn't answer immediately. "I'm not judging," Dr. Park said. She was pulling off gloves with the practiced precision of decades. "I treated a warlord once in Liberia. Complicated feelings are part of the work when the work involves keeping specific people alive." "That's not reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be." Dr. Park looked at her directly. "He's not an ordinary man. His world is not your world. Those two facts are real, and they will continue to be real, regardless of what you feel." She paused. "The question isn't whether caring about him is complicated. The question is whether you can hold your own in the complications." Lila looked at the wall. "I don't know the answer to that." "That's the most honest thing I've heard all week," Dr. Park said. She sat with Victor for the rest of that night and the day that followed. He slept in uneven intervals, waking sometimes lucid and sometimes in the disoriented, half-present way of someone whose body is absorbing what happened. Keon brought food she barely touched. She monitored vitals on a rhythm she could have done unconscious herself at this point. On the second morning, Victor woke while she was updating her notes at the small desk in the corner of the clinic. The light was early and gray. She heard him shift and turned to find him watching her with an alertness that meant he'd been awake for a few minutes before she noticed. "How do you feel?" she said, standing. Moving to him. "Like I was shot," he said. "Accurate." She checked his pulse. His hand was warm under hers, and neither of them moved for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Infection markers are down. You're going to have significant pain for the next week. I'm going to give you a medication protocol that you will actually follow." "I follow protocols." "You were trying to sit up 4 hours after surgery. You don't follow protocols." Something moved through his expression. "You were watching." "I'm a nurse. I'm always watching." She stepped back. "You should also know that whatever happened 2 nights ago, whoever did this, Kia needs to address it. Because if this is going to keep happening, I can't keep..." She stopped. "Can't keep what?" he said. And his voice was quieter now, the quality it took on in their Thursday conversations. She looked at him. "I can't keep doing this," she said carefully. "If what I'm doing is keeping you alive, so something worse can happen to you next month." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, not a transformation, but the way a landscape changes when a cloud moves off the sun. Small, significant. I've been making contingency plans, he said. For what? For leaving, he said. Not immediately, but building toward it. Delegating pieces, restructuring, reducing my direct exposure. It takes time and it takes care because the kind of enterprise I manage doesn't have a graceful exit unless you build one. She sat down in the chair beside him. How long? 18 months, he said. Maybe less. If things move the way I've planned. She looked at him. And what happens after that? That, he said, depends on variables I don't fully control yet. She understood that she was one of the variables. She sat with that understanding without naming it out loud, and he let her, and that was the most honest conversation they'd had about it so far, which was saying something and saying nothing at all simultaneously. She went back to her apartment that evening for the first time in 36 hours. She showered, ate the meal-prepped rice and beans she'd made the Sunday before and not touched since, called her sister, and talked for an hour about nothing that was actually about the things they were both thinking about. Her sister said, "You sound different." And Lila said, "How different?" And her sister said, "I don't know, like you're somewhere else a little bit?" And Lila said, "Yeah, maybe a little bit." She went back to the clinic the following morning. Victor was sitting up on the edge of the exam table when she arrived, which was both a medical improvement and an immediate cause for frustration. "You were supposed to stay horizontal," she said, setting down her bag. "I have a call in an hour," he said. "You have a bullet wound," she said. "The bullet wound outranks the call." "Not in my world." "You're in my world right now," she said, "and in my world the bullet wound wins." He looked at her. She looked at him. Something crackled in the air between them that she was getting less and less able to pretend was just professional tension. "Lila," he said. "Victor," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the fact that you stayed." She busied herself with checking his wound, which was a coward's move, and she knew it. "I'm your nurse. It's my job." "It's not your job to stay through the night. Your job description did not include 40-hour vigils." He was very still as she worked, his voice level, but carrying something underneath it she'd learned to hear. That was a choice. She didn't answer. "I would like," he said, "to understand what that choice means to you." She set down the instrument she was holding. She looked at him directly, which she'd learned was the only language he fully respected. "It means I'm not neutral about what happens to you," she said. "It means that when Kian called me at 4 a.m, and I knew you were hurt, my response was not professional detachment. It means," she paused, "that I'm in more complicated territory than I expected to be when I took this job." He held her gaze without blinking. "Is that a problem?" She thought about Dr. Park's question, whether she could hold her own in the complications. "Not if we're honest about it," she said. "I'm incapable of being anything else," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the most unsettling thing about you." He almost smiled. Fully this time, the non-smile resolved into something that was actually and unmistakably a smile, brief and genuine and startling in the way it changed his face, the way it made him look like someone who had laughed in a past life and remembered how. "More unsettling than finding out you entered a crime lord's car?" "Oh, way more," she said, "that I could categorize. You being consistently and inconveniently honest is genuinely destabilizing." He looked at her for another moment. "I haven't been this honest with anyone in a long time, he said. "It's also somewhat destabilizing." She sat in the chair beside him. The morning light came through the blinds in pale stripes. Outside, the city was waking up. The ordinary sounds of traffic and delivery trucks and early workers, all the machinery of a regular day proceeding, as if two people in a third-floor clinic in Belltown were not having a conversation that neither of them had expected to be having when they woke up that morning. "The rival faction," she said after a while. "Sung's people. Is it over?" "Not yet," he said, "but Kian is handling it, and I have made it clear that I'm not pursuing escalation. I've given enough of my years to that cycle." "What does not pursuing escalation look like in your world?" "It looks like paying for a very clean, very decisive resolution that does not require me to be present for any part of it." He paused. "I'm aware that's not a comfortable answer." "No," she said, "but it's an honest one." She looked at him. "I'm going to keep asking you questions like this?" I know. And you're going to keep answering them. He held her gaze. Yes? She nodded slowly. Okay, she said. Then I'm going to tell you something. She folded her hands in her lap. I need you to actually follow your medication protocol. Not because I'm your nurse, because I would like you to still be alive in 18 months when those contingency plans are finished, and you cannot achieve that if you treat pain management like a suggestion. That's the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, he said, completely flat. She started laughing. She hadn't expected to laugh. It came out full and real, and he watched it happen with an expression that she could only describe as quiet wonder, the way someone looks at a thing they hadn't realized they were hoping for. Take your medication, she said when she'd recovered. Yes, he said. She gave him the protocol. She made him repeat it back to her. He did, with the precise recall of someone who forgot nothing and the specific attentiveness of someone who wanted her to know he was paying attention. She rechecked his wounds, updated her notes, and made sure the next 48 hours of monitoring were arranged. She was at the door when he said her name. She turned. The night you got into my car, he said. When you woke up and found yourself in the garage, you weren't afraid. I was afraid, she said. I was just quiet about it. He nodded. That's what I mean. She stood in the doorway. Victor? Yes? The 18 months, she said. What does after look like, specifically, not variables? What do you want it to look like? He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, the quiet of a man choosing words because words meant something. Smaller, he said, quieter, something that doesn't require me to know where all the exits are. He paused. Something with enough room for the complications I've been accumulating. She looked at him. He looked at her. That's a reasonable place to aim for, she said. She went down the back stairway, through the building, out into the street where the city was fully awake now and the sky had gone from gray to a pale, tentative blue. She put her earbuds in. She thought about 18 months, about the scaffolding of her own life, about her sister's surgery and her student loans, and the Tuesday patient she'd lost, and the thing that had been building since a rainy night when she'd gotten into a black Mercedes by mistake. She thought about the fact that she was not afraid, not of the complications, not of the moral complexity, not of the specific, unsettling honesty of a man who had spent 20 years building walls and was apparently willing, for reasons she was only beginning to understand, to start taking them down from the inside. She was not afraid. And she was quiet about it, and those two things together, she thought, might be exactly enough. 3 months later, Lila was finishing a Thursday visit when Victor showed her a document. It was on his phone, a few pages, legal language, corporate restructuring, the kind of thing that meant nothing to someone outside his world and everything to someone inside it. Phase 1, huh? He said. She looked at the screen, not fully comprehending the specifics but understanding the direction. How many phases? 6. And you're on 1. Yes. He looked at her. But I've started. She handed the phone back. Good, she said. Outside, the sun was actually out, which was not an everyday occurrence in Seattle and felt, she decided, like something worth noting. Your blood pressure is significantly better, by the way. The stress reduction is already showing up in your metrics. I've had some things to look forward to, he said. She gathered her bag. She was almost at the door before she turned back, which had become a thing she did, she realized. Turned back, found him already watching. I called my sister this morning, she said. She has a surgery date. Insurance is covering it. I was able to make up the gap. Something shifted in his face. Warmth, full and unguarded, the face beneath the assembled face. Good, he said quietly. I just wanted you to know, she said, that this... She gestured, not quite at the room, more at everything the room represented, has done some real good. He nodded. He didn't look away. See you next Thursday, she said. She walked out into the Seattle sunshine. Behind her she heard nothing, no footsteps, no voice, just the quiet of a man sitting with something he hadn't had in a long time, the possibility of a different kind of future, and the specific, rare peace of someone already beginning to believe in it. If this story kept you hooked from the first rainy night to the last ray of sunshine, you already know what to do. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us which moment got you, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. The next one is already waiting.